Okay, I'm here with Michael Jones from Inspiring Philosophy for the second time. So, Mike, thanks for coming again.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me.
Cool, man. If you just want to take a quick moment to introduce yourself for people who may have not seen our first discussion.
Yeah, I run Inspiring Philosophy. I make a lot of apologetic videos defending the biblical worldview and a theistic evolutionist account of it.
Cool. All right. So today we're going to discuss hell. Really exciting conversation.
Yeah.
Not that morbid, you know. So yeah, we're just going to get right into it. Mike, what is hell?
Well, yeah,
Kind of,
people typically want an elevator pitch on that, and
yeah,
you
yeah,
can't really give that.
right.
It's best to sort of explain what hell is not so people get a better idea. Hell is not some sort of torture chamber that God throws people into, that they're like trying to climb to get out of the side. You know, you've seen like the chick publications, for example. It's like this big fiery pit, and all these people are like, oh, if only I would have repented before this. That's not what hell is. Hell is not a place where Satan hangs out and everyone has a rock and roll party either. Hell is a much more complicated subject in the Bible, especially the New Testament. What I tend to define it as is the same way Tim Keller defines it: is that hell is a freely chosen identity that is built on something else besides God, going on forever. The fire that burns in hell is the fire of the soul. It's the inner selfishness, the pride, the greed that has not been squashed out, that's still there, and it's just burning within them. So picture your vices. If you keep going on, they're going to keep getting worse. If you do not accept the grace of God, if you do not accept the Holy Spirit, the those vices will continue to keep getting worse and worse, and that will become your own hell. What I like to use is the analogy of the spoiled kid who lives in his parents' basement. His parents might think they're doing something well by protecting him, by letting him just live there, not worry about getting a job, just living off them. But over time, he gets more lazy. He gets more disgruntled. He gets more depressed. He's not really done anything with his life. And if he's there by the time he turns 60, he'll be basically a menace to society, or somebody who no one really wants to be around. He'll never have worked in his life. He'll have never accomplished anything. He'll just basically have lived his life in his parents' basement. And you could sort of see those vices getting worse and worse in people over time, to the point where they don't really have anything to show for themselves. They don't really have anything good within them. Now, if the soul goes on beyond death, those vices are just going to keep getting worse. And if you're separated from God, that will be hell.
Mhm. Okay, so what do you think about to kind of segue into this, about this moral revulsion? There's kind of like a revulsion about hell, when people hear that, oh, how could there be a hell? I mean, what do you think about that? There seems to be this revulsion or this disgust.
Yeah, it is. It does appear that a lot of objections to Christianity do reduce the nature of hell.
Mhm.
And I feel like it's based on that fundamentalist understanding, this fiery pit that God is sort of throwing people into.
Right,
And
right.
that's not what hell is. When people understand what hell really is, they have a different perspective on it, and they go, okay, I guess that can make sense.
Yeah.
It's just, hell is basically what people want in the end if they reject God. So
Mhm.
God gives everybody what they want. If you want to be with God, which is heaven, you get that. If you want to be apart from hell and try to build your own kingdom, you get that too. God just warns you, if you do that, it's going to be like, no pun intended, but it's going to be hell.
Mhm.
Your vices will get worse. Your depression will get worse. Your hatred, your anger, it will just keep slowly consuming you until there's nothing left. So I think a lot of the revulsion to hell comes from a misunderstanding of what actually is. And it
Right,
stems from a lot of Christians who fail to actually understand and explain hell, and explain it in terms of what it should be understood as,
right,
because it's very deeply connected to understanding of sin, and that needs to be pointed out.
right. That's a good point. And we'll kind of touch upon this in question four, but I think a lot of people, when they talk about hell, are not talking about the psychology of hell. They're talking about the ontology, which, I mean, I don't know if we could ever even know what that would be like. So that right there seems pretty, an inaccurate way to go about it.
Correct. Yeah, I would
Right.
agree.
Okay. So question two, can God be both perfectly loving, yet at the same time, even create a state of affairs where there is such a place as hell?
Well, I would say, how could God? My response to that is typically, how could God be all loving and not allow for hell?
It's
I
a
mean,
good
if you
point.
love someone, you let them go. You don't try to force them to be something that they don't want to be. If God is perfectly loving, he is not going to force people into heaven with him. He's going to allow them to go out into darkness, outer darkness, and try to build their own kingdom, because that's what they want. So if God is going to be perfectly loving, he's not going to force them to be something they're not. And so I think it's perfectly consistent with a loving God. Now, the fundamentalist understanding of hell, this big fiery pit that people are thrown into and they want to get out of, yeah, I would say that's inconsistent with a loving God, but not the biblical understanding of hell.
Hmm. And this notion of accountability as well. I mean, it seems perfectly loving to me that people are going to be held accountable for their actions. I mean, on an atheistic paradigm, if there really is no God, then there's no moral difference between what Hitler did and Mother Teresa. There's nothing happens. There's no accountability for any of those actions. So it
Correct.
does seem consistent with love. Yeah.
It absolutely does. Seems consistent with the ethical framework that's laid out, is that people will get what they deserve or what they want. And
Mm.
as C.S. Lewis said, all that are in hell choose it. I mean, the doors of hell are locked from the inside. It's not like they're being forced there.
Right.
It's what Dan Barker said in a debate one time, that if God is real, I would tell him to go to hell and I would walk away from him. He doesn't want to be with God. Well, that's what we say hell is.
Right. Right. Yeah. Okay. So question 3, does God send people to hell? We kind of just touched upon that. But I just want to just kind of hammer home on this other issue of like, and you did kind of address this, but just this notion that this a hell does exist. God has kind of he's orchestrated the game here. So some people will feel kind of like, well, this just isn't fair right on the face. You know what I mean? Like, so it kind of feels
Yeah.
like God sends you to hell, but he's
Well,
not. You're arguing,
if hell is just the result of a soul putting themselves first,
Mhm.
it just is a natural product of God creating free creatures. Because there's a moment where you're a self and you can always put yourself before others or before God. If you have that freedom and God says, well, putting yourself first will create pride, jealousy, and will create hell, it just is going to naturally follow from the very product of creating free creatures. I mean, if God were to create I would say a logically incoherent world, but a world where putting yourself first just brings you pleasure,
Mhm.
I mean, you wouldn't really even be an agent. You would just sort of be an autonomous pleasure agent that runs around, a autonomous pleasure robot that runs around and just seeks pleasure because it's good for you. There'd be
Right.
no relationship there. There'd be no connection.
Mhm.
So if we're created to be creatures that are in relationships, that are serving others while we're being served by others, that are constantly loving and being in a community, then rejecting that and putting yourself first, putting yourself in the God position, will bring about hell because you're rejecting your very nature, what you were made to be. It's very hard for there not to be a hell in this scenario if God is going to create free creatures. So I have a hard time seeing how this logically could work. And when I bring this up to atheists and agnostics, I don't really get a satisfying answer.
Mhm. Yeah, that makes sense. So question 4, if there is a hell, do we have any clue what the ontology of hell would be like? Or is it just much more beneficial, like we previously mentioned, to really hammer home on this psychology of hell? Right? Because I think
But
that's the proper way to go about this, making people aware that, hey, you can be in hell right now, right? This self-imposed misery that you put on yourself from turning away from God and indulging in your sins and becoming your own God, right? Becoming,
mhm.
you know,
Yeah, I think the only ontology we can know is that it's separation from God.
mm,
The psychology of hell, I think, better explains what hell is. And the ontology of wherever that is doesn't really matter at that point. Once you
yeah,
understand the basic psychology of what hell is, the ontology has just become such a minor issue. It doesn't even really float in the front of the entire question anymore. It just sort of falls into the background. I mean, the simplest way I can say is hell is just separation from God.
mm,
It's when people reject God and they sort of just walk away into outer darkness where his light isn't there, and his light isn't there. So that's what hell is. It's away from the light of God.
right. So question 5, is hell eternal?
Yeah, that's a controversial question.
Yeah.
My take on this is that I don't know. I think it is a minor issue on this. I don't think it's the main point.
Mm,
The three views on hell are universalism, annihilationism, and eternal conscious torment. Eternal conscious torment is that hell is eternal. The souls will be
right.
there forever. This is Clay Jones's view. Another view, annihilationism, is the idea that souls are sort of annihilated on like Judgment Day or something. Universalism is the idea that everyone gets out of hell and comes into heaven. I hope that's true. But I would consider myself an eventual annihilationist.
Okay.
So I think hell is real. I think souls go there and they eventually annihilate. It's that God is not going to do it for them. You want to be God, you go figure out a way to annihilate yourself. I'm not going to do that. My plan for you is much better. You should take my plan, but I'm not going to do something for you like that. It's your job to figure out how to be annihilated if that's what you want.
Right. Now, would you,
So
oh, just real quick, would you say that the Bible is pretty ambiguous on this matter? I mean, is it clear? I mean, it
no,
seems,
I mean, you can make a. I've seen people that are very hardcore eternal conscious torment or very hardcore annihilationist or even universalist make very strong cases from biblical text they pull. And
yeah,
honestly, I look at that and go, yeah, I think you're all making very good cases, but I mean, I don't think that's the important question. I think the psychology of hell is really the important question. And at
yeah,
the end
I
of the day,
agree.
I don't really care. Like I would say I'm an eventual annihilationist, but if like someone came to me and says, "No, you're wrong. Here is this other view, and this is the correct view," I'd be like, "Interesting case, buddy. Anyway, I hope you have a good life." Like I'm not going to fight about that. It's not a
Right.
big deal to me.
Yeah, I mean, my problem with this notion of an eternal hell really is it's devoid of this moral improvement, right? It seems like when you're, punishment in any meaningful sense and just sense would be a way of improving, right? So if hell is eternal, there is no room for improvement. And I've read a lot of David Bentley Hart.
Mm-hmm.
You're familiar with him, right? I read That All Shall Be Saved, and he
Yeah.
has this. I forget where it's at, but he says one will only ever begin to suffer because there's no end, right? So you could be in hell for a million years and you've just begun.
Mm-hmm.
So that to
Yeah.
me is that's powerful. And that just seems so problematic if hell is indeed eternal.
Yeah. And for me, it's like I understand some of the arguments Clay Jones makes in his book Immortal. I think he does put out some pretty interesting ideas for an eternal hell, but I don't think it's necessary what he's arguing for in there. His basic idea is that is if hell is not eternal, we will never be able to glorify the bad guy like we do now. Like we glorify villains from the past and whatnot.
Mm.
We sort of like put them on a pedestal sometimes. And so he says if hell is eternal, we won't be able to ever do that because we'll always be able to see them in their current state and know they don't deserve that. That's possible. But I don't think it's a necessary inference from his view. I think you can have that. And I think humans can have soul building to the point where they mature to the point they would not glorify villains of the past. So,
Right.
so again, it's one of those things. It's like I don't really think hell needs to be eternal.
Mhm.
It probably isn't, especially on my view. But who knows? At the end of the day,
Right. Okay. So, question 6, will God feel pain for those who are in hell and want to get out? Again, I mean, this is predicated on the notion if hell is eternal, right?
right?
Will God,
Yeah, I think God will, and I think those that are in hell can get out.
okay.
I think that if they wanted to, they truly could. The
Mm,
problem is at that point they basically rejected God. They've established their identity, and it's very very unlikely they ever would.
mm,
But I do think it is possible. I don't think they're eternally condemned, since I would consider myself a legal universalist, meaning that all that want to be in heaven are welcome. The only people that are in hell are the people that choose to be there.
mm,
So anybody can be in heaven. It's just that most people in hell will not take that path because of the pain it would cause going through sanctification, humbling yourself, having to deal with your sins. It would be most people will
right.
just reject it.
Yeah. I mean, if
So
God, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, yeah, I
Yeah.
do think God does feel pain for them in hell, but it's not so much a pain that affects his identity. It's more like it's quite. This may not truly capture it, but it'd be more like it's quite a shame this soul, this child of mine, has chosen that path.
Oh, okay.
But it is
Mm.
their choice, and ultimately that must be respected.
Yeah. Because if it is eternal, you would wonder how God would expunge this from his mind if God is the eternal wellspring of love itself.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the love that we have for one another as human beings would not even nearly graduate to the love that God possesses.
Yeah.
So, it would be really difficult to see this eternal paradigm how God would deal with this, emotionally. So,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is an interesting conundrum, I think, for the eternal views of hell.
right. So, Question 7, if God allows his creation, rational agents, to suffer forever, can he really be said to be good and just?
Um, well, I mean, ultimately, he is the source of
Right,
goodness,
the
and
arbiter. Yeah.
if a soul is truly evil, and so even someone like Wayne Grudem believes in eternal hell. He says that the souls there are not suffering for finite sins on earth. It's that they continue to be evil and continue to curse God there, so they continue to suffer because of that. So in that sort of setting, I don't think it affects God's justice on an eternal view. I think it's perfectly rational that God could still be all good and all just, and for souls to still be suffer forever. It's
Mhm.
that they have chosen that, and God has allowed that kind of thing. Now, again, that's not my view, but I think it could still work. I would have to hear a pretty strong argument against that, though, and they may be out there.
Yeah. I mean, what about just intuitively like religious pluralism? That just, I mean, it's just maybe not as clear, you know?
Right. And I always refer people to places like John 9:41,
Okay.
John 15:22, where Jesus says, if I had come, they would not be guilty, but now that I have come, they have no excuse.
Mhm.
An inference you can draw from that is that, well, there are people who he has not come directly to, like the Pharisees he's speaking of. So they would be judged on different information. Paul says in Romans 5:13 that where there is, where there is no sin, where there is no law, there is no sin. So people who have not been given the law are going to be judged differently than people who have been given much better direct evidence. So this also
Yeah.
relates to why I think there is like postmortem salvation possibilities. I do think some of those souls that never had proper understanding will still have an opportunity after.
Mhm.
But I mean, it's not like just denying them the gospel means they get a free ticket to heaven. That's not how it works. They still have to choose if they choose goodness or themselves. And so that choice still needs to be made. One thing I remind people is I don't think the ontology of the afterlife is less complex than it is here on Earth. I think it's more complex. I
Mm.
don't think people are just, like dead and then therefore they are at some sort of courtroom and they're being judged by God. Like you get like the chip publications, for example. I think the ontology of the afterlife is still going to be pretty complex. We just don't have any privilege to that right now. So,
Yeah.
so I
Interesting.
think there's chances for postmortem salvation for those people who've not heard the gospel, like an Aboriginal woman born on 200 AD on Australia.
Or a
It's not
baby,
going to have the same
you know?
opportunity as like Caiaphas. So they're
Yeah.
going to be judged differently based. And I think that's implied in the Bible.
Okay. That's a good explanation. All right, let's see here. Question 8. What did Jesus say about hell? I talk to a lot of people and they want to know, what did Jesus say about it? You know?
Yeah. So Jesus talked in a lot of parables about hell. So he talks about hell like being a place where there's wailing and gnashing of teeth. Like it's an
Mhm.
outer darkness. It's a fire. The problem is a lot of these are parables. So, like at one point, gives a parable in the Gospel of Luke, where he's basically comparing himself to Herod Archelaus. And Sam Harris is famous for taking a passage out of that parable out of context, where Jesus says,
Yeah.
as Herod Archelaus in this parable, bring my enemies before me and slaughter them. Okay, that's a parable. He doesn't really want you to bring his enemies before him and slaughter him. He's making a comparison to something Herod Archelaus did. Okay,
Yeah.
so we have to be careful with reading too much into parables. But
Yeah.
Jesus does talk a lot about hell. And the general theological message from the parables is that hell is separation from God. It's a place that souls reside where they have already rejected God because they have, in the parables, like they showed up to the party improperly dressed, dishonoring God, not giving him proper honor, not giving him proper lordship. So they're rejected. They're thrown out. But they're rejected and thrown out because they've already accepted that identity. They've already accepted this identity of dishonoring God in the parables. The most famous parable is, of course, of rich man and Lazarus.
Mhm.
And the interesting thing about that parable, as many people have noted, is that the rich man never asks to get out of hell. He just tries to get Lazarus into hell.
Mm.
Send Lazarus over to cool my tongue, but I don't want to go up there with you guys. That'd be ridiculous. Like he doesn't ever
Yeah.
ask, Father Abraham, can you please send me a rope down or some sort of bridge to get me out of here? He's just like, I don't really want to.
Right.
And he
Right.
strongly implies it's God's fault he's there. So he still is not even accepting God's lordship. He's still rejecting that mentality.
Mhm.
So that's kind of what we get from Jesus on hell. He's teaching more about the psychology of hell, not so much the ontology of it.
Okay. So the next question would be, what is Paul's view on hell? Does Paul have a different view on hell, or is it similar to Jesus's?
Well, again, I think Paul focuses more on the psychology. A famous passage I like to bring up is 2 Thessalonians 1:9, where he's talking about this, and he says, they will suffer the punishment of eternal destruction away from the presence of the Lord, from the glory of his might. So it seems like this casting of outer darkness, like they're suffering destruction away from God. So that's one of the verses I use for my eventual annihilationism kind of idea.
Mhm.
That they're sort of cast away from God, and then they suffer destruction away from him. So I think it's very similar to Jesus. I don't think they're really contradicting each other. I think they're just more trying to focus on the psychology of it all.
Mhm.
So I'm trying to say Paul is a pretty strong annihilationist.
Okay.
Possibly, yeah, I could see that. But again, it's like I was mentioning earlier, I don't think it's a big issue.
Now, would you say that when you're talking about Paul being a pretty strong annihilationist, um, is that contingent on someone who wants to be annihilated? Right. In other words, if someone
Yeah.
says, no, I don't want to be annihilated. I want to be with you, God. I made a mistake. I was a prideful individual. I want to rid myself of pride and come into the kingdom. Is that the kind of thing Paul's talking about? Or
I think that's implicit in Paul's. I mean,
okay,
he never directly says that.
right.
But at one point in Corinthians, he says, all of us, he's talking to Christians at this point. He says, we will all stand before the judgment seat of God and give an account of all things we've done.
Mm,
And my view is that the reason why souls stay in hell is they don't want to do that. They don't want to go through the life experience, have to account for everything, have to feel the shame, the misery, the harm they've caused other people, because that's painful. That's a hard process. It's the same with like someone who's addicted to drugs. They may not like being a drug addict. They may not like living on the streets, but it's far better than having to go through rehab where they have to get over this addiction and give up the drug and then build a whole new life from ground up, where they start like at a minimum wage job and work their way up through a shelter. Doesn't sound fun to any of us, but we know it's necessary to be what it is to be human, to be a mature adult. So you can sort of look at the souls in hell in that same mentality. Sure, hell is bad, but I can't imagine going through this process of standing before the judgment seat, having to account for everything I've done, be sanctified, humble myself, this kind of mentality. And so that's what hell is on this view. It's this idea that the souls in hell are going to suffer away from the eternal destruction of God instead of coming before the judgment seat and giving an account of all they've done.
okay. So question 11 actually, sorry, 10. You kind of touched on this briefly, but if you just want to expand on it a tad more, what is annihilationism?
Yeah, I think we kind of covered that.
Yeah.
It's the idea that God annihilates souls.
Okay.
When that happens or how that happens can be up for debate.
Yeah.
I don't think God directly does that. I don't think God is going to annihilate souls. I think that just is against his nature. All that hate me love death. God doesn't want to cause that sort of thing, but they could do it to themselves if they figure it out.
Yeah. So you would say there's some kind of process of purification before the like, again, I'm just people want to be annihilated. Is that what you're saying?
I would say there are souls in hell, and the further they move away from God's presence into hatred, pride, and envy and sin, they annihilate themselves.
Okay.
You as a conscious agent are contingent upon God.
Right.
And the further you get away from the source of what gives you life, the more you annihilate, and eventually you'll just fall out of existence on that.
Okay, so question 11, will people in heaven know that their loved ones are suffering in hell?
No, that's a good question. I don't fully know. I would say most likely yes, but I would say it's not too much of a problem. Now, you may ask, well, what do you mean by that? Well, for the people that it's going to be a problem for, it's because they didn't build their identity on God, but on this loved one. That this loved one is really the identity they live upon. And so if you have that mentality, sure, that would be torture for you to see that person going through hell.
Yeah.
If your identity is built on God, it should be able to get you through anything. And the way I explain it is like, you got to think of it as like a woman who was in a marriage. She loved her husband and her husband started abusing her. It sucks at first, but eventually she realizes she has to leave and get on with her life. She can get over that husband, even though there was a time where she thought she never could, and she really loved him, and she moved on with her life. It's that woman realized her husband became a demon, became the monster, and she has forgiven him, moved on, realized that's not going to give her her identity, and she's moved on to something better. The souls in heaven will look at souls in hell in a similar way. It's that they have chosen this for themselves. They have chosen to become the monsters. And it's unfortunate but the person I once loved is no longer there. They have just become a monster at this point, and we've given them over to God. We've given them over to themselves. They can move on, and then those people in heaven will be able to move on because their identity is really built upon God, not upon having these people in their life. And it's like once you see the monster they become, you realize they're not that same person anymore. Like
Right. That's
they
interesting.
become someone new, you know.
Mhm. Okay, so question 12, Mike. Can one truly, in any meaningful sense, freely, or I'm sorry, sorry, I worded that wrong. Can one truly, I'm sorry. Oh, okay. Can one freely reject God? Can they really freely reject God? David Bentley Hart has this chapter in his book. I forget, I haven't read the whole book, but he kind of argues that you can't really freely reject God and send yourself to this eternal hell.
Yeah, I feel like that's just I don't agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I would say it's a Morian fact that we have free will. Like we have this choice that we're able to make. We have the ability to do otherwise, and so I would say that's a Morian fact in and of itself, which basically just means it's in a layman terms, it means you got to prove to me otherwise before I reject something that seems so intuitive.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, he also says somewhere too, because there's this notion that God allows you, right, to send yourself to hell out of respect for your autonomy. Well, he says somewhere that that's kind of like unnatural for a father. Imagine if a father, his daughter was about to thrust her face into a pit of fire, and he said, "Well, I'll let you do that just out of respect for your autonomy."
Yeah, I don't think that's
you don't think
a
that's
good
a
analogy
good
that captures
Okay.
it. It's more better since we're talking about the psychology of hell. It's more like a father who has a daughter or a son who becomes addicted to drugs, and they keep showing up. They keep stealing money. They're influencing their younger siblings. Eventually, that father's going to be like, "You have made your choice. Get out of my house. I need to protect my flock. I need to protect my family from the monster you have become. I am here for you if you ever want to repent, if you ever want to be the prodigal son and come home, but you cannot be here as if you're going to keep remaining that monster." And every father in that situation would do, that's logical and mature, would do such a thing to protect the others. So I don't think the analogy of before really fits. I think God does give people this free choice to either become a son of God or become a monster. And God is not going to force them to not become a monster if that's what they truly want.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Yeah, I guess that analogy could have some issues with it. I can see that.
I mean, yeah, we all could see a father preventing their son or daughter from throwing themselves into a fire because, first of all, we're emotionally attached to them. We understand, like, no, don't do that. I'm going to run in there. But if, like, my child joined a suicide cult, okay, I could chain her up in a basement, but like, ultimately she's going to die anyway, or she's going to keep trying to get away and do it. What am I going to do? Like to the end of the day, I can call the authorities. I can say she's mentally deranged. But if she is not, if she really does truly think she needs to kill herself, if she becomes an adult, how am I going to stop her? It'd be horrible for me. And I would. I mean, I'm not saying I wouldn't, but eventually she's going to figure out a way to do it, regardless if I, unless I chain her up in like, in like one of those suicide places for the rest of her life, which some people do. But we ultimately realize that those type of people are sick and they need help. But if she dies and she still thinks that way, and she goes to hell, I mean, there's nothing I can do eventually. I cannot keep doing that for eternity.
Right.
Eventually you got to give them up.
And I think that argument about, the thrusting of the child's face into the fire out of respect for her autonomy it's really just predicated on this notion of an eternal hell. You know what I mean? As that whole book is. I mean, it's a book for universalism. But So 13. Or do you have anything else to say? No?
Well, I mean, the next question is thoughts on universalism. And my thoughts is I hope people like David Bentley Hart are right. Like I was asked one time to debate.
I've seen you say this before too. Yeah.
Yeah. I was asked one time to debate a universalist, and I said no, because I hope they're right.
Right. I heard
atheists always say, like, I really hope your religion is true. But I'm like, no, you don't, because you're debating it. I don't think that's entirely true. I can see maybe there's an aspect of you to think it is, but not entirely. I don't debate universalism because I want universalism to be true. I don't really want to put out like a case against it because I'm really hoping that it actually is true.
I mean, and who wouldn't hope for that? You know what I mean? I mean, even from a Thomistic perspective, like being itself is the good. the highest good. That's what we orient our will towards. We're immersed in being. I
Yeah.
can't see anyone who would really say, oh no, I want them to suffer for eternity. I want this to happen. Now, maybe you take like a Nietzschean perspective of like this, this resentment for people, this deep resentment where, hey, I can't get you in this life, but in the next one, you're screwed. You're going to be there forever. So I think there's a lot of, psychology going into all of this as well.
Yeah. And I think the idea of universalism is great. It's not inconsistent with hell, because on universalism, a lot of views, it's that those that reject God now go to hell until they realize they're wrong and then they get out, which sounds fine to me. I think, I mean, I hope that's true. I think my problem with it is that I just have a hard time seeing a soul that has truly chosen to reject God. Someone like Christopher Hitchens, who said, I don't want to be in to celestial North Korea worshiping the dear leader forever.
Right.
Or someone like Dan Barker, who, they have clearly chosen this identity of rejecting God. Mm-hmm. It seems very hard that they are just going to somehow wake up one day and turn around without having their free will taken away.
Yeah.
Now, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's something else in the next life that I just don't know. And we're going to get over there and realize universalism is true. I'm going to be like, wonderful. Like
it would. Yeah. I mean,
I really hope, it's like, there's nothing against me that's saying like, no, because look, as I said, universalism is not inconsistent with hell. So pointing out there's a hell that some people are going to go to, it's not inconsistent with the idea they're going to get out in maybe like 10 or 30 years or something.
Yeah.
I hope
process of purification. And I mean, even like, Gregory of Nyssa, Maximus the Confessor, Origen, they're all, they all believe in universalism. They're all universalist. And this kind of ties in with another question I had for you, like reading the eschatological visions of the book of Revelation. How are we to read that? You know what I mean? Because in the patristic and medieval periods, they're following the meaning through, but they're not reading it in like a literalist sense. You know what I mean? So
yeah, I mean, it's hard because Revelations is very cryptic, and people often want to pick and choose the parts out they want to be literal versus the parts metaphorical. And I have a hard time believing that. I think a lot of it is hyperbolic when it talks about the souls in hell, like the eternal fire and whatnot. I think it doesn't necessarily, especially the original Greek, doesn't necessarily teach eternity. Eternity is sort of read into the text. So there's a lot of complexity there, and it would take a deep dive to really go through a lot of that.
Yeah, and another thing too, I mean, there could be a lot of benefit, the fact that the Bible may be ambiguous on that. I mean, imagine if the Bible just said, hey, no, you're all going to be saved. Just, what would the consequences of that be? Well, people could just do anything they want. I mean, look how evil the world already is with this notion of an eternal hell, this notion of a hell at all, right? So maybe there is some, benefit in the Bible being ambiguous about it.
Yeah, I think it is. And I also think history says a very interesting story. So this could be a case for universalism. It's like, take yourself back to like the 500s BC when Jerusalem falls and the remaining Jews there, I mean, at least the elites, they're taken to Babylon. If you would have went to them and you would have told them that one day the world's greatest religions are going to worship Yahweh, they're going to be built on the faith of Abraham, Christianity is going to spread all the way around the world. People on the other continents you've never even heard of are going to have millions of Christians, people worshiping Yahweh. They would have looked at you like you're nuts. Like, what are you talking about? Marduk, the god of Babylon, just came in and destroyed our temple. I mean, Yahweh is defeated. Our religion is dead. Our identity is dead. There's nothing good could ever come out about this. And so, well, obviously they would be wrong. I mean, just look at what happened given enough time. So we may be looking at it now, like looking at souls right now and going, there's no way some of these people could ever return to God or bend the knee to Yahweh. But we very might be wrong about that. Maybe given enough time in a hell-like environment, they will eventually come, and then every knee shall bow and every tongue will confess that he is God. But I mean, it may just be our limited perspective right now on the whole issue.
Right.
And like, we are like the Jew that's on their way to exile. We just don't see the bigger picture that's going to come over the next 2,500 years. And that could very well be the case when it comes to hell. We just cannot even see the idea of someone like Dan Barker accepting they were wrong, or Christopher Hitchens actually in heaven singing the praises of God. Like, it just seems so far beyond reach.
That would be interesting to see.
It would be. It would be wonderful to see. But.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So this is the last question here. how could God allow a vicious serial killer into heaven, but not a person who is genuinely just unsure, maybe confused by religious pluralism, or maybe they just say, hey, I'm just an agnostic. I don't know, man. I mean, there's a lot of things going on. I just simply don't know. Right.
Yeah, I feel like the response to that is God allows everyone into heaven.
Hmm.
I believe Dallas Willard said that God will allow anyone into heaven that can stomach it.
Yeah.
Anybody can come into heaven. It's not so much that he's not allowing the person who's unsure. He's saying, come into heaven. He's telling the same thing to the serial killer, to that person. Come in, you're going to be sanctified. We're going to go through your life. You're going to experience the shame of your sins, so you know the pain it caused, and you can grow from that.
Hmm.
The serial killer is going to experience a heck of a lot of pain in hell or in heaven, going through sanctification. They got to experience what they did to their victims. Probably less than the person that's just confused. It's just going to be, the question is if each of those people are going to make that choice and go into heaven.
Yeah, that makes sense. Trying to see if I had anything else to add on that. Yeah, man, I think that's it. Short interview, but I think it was pretty packed, man. It was good. So thanks for being here, Mike. I appreciate it, man.
Yeah, of course. Glad to help.
Cool. Yeah, we'll talk soon.
Awesome. Okay. Sounds good.
All right.